I want to ask us to, I'm going to show you a number of images that represent America. And this is the very first. This is a map, a giant map, much bigger than this stage, a wall-sized map of actually 12 giant printing sheets. The first map of the world to represent the part of the world that was called at the time the fourth part of the world. The first three parts being Europe, Asia, and Africa. The German map maker Martin Waldseemüller had read Amerigo Vespucci's The New World and decided to depict this fourth part of the world on his map of the world. It's the giant green blob over there between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And Waldseemüller did something a little bit desperate, which was he had no name for this fourth part of the world. And he decided, in honor of Amerigo Vespucci, which is the one book about this part of the world that he had read, to label this landmass America. And it's really for this strange happenstance of history, this one German mapmaker's decision to use the word America to label this part of the world that he had no other noun for, that accounts for how the north and southern continents of the Americas now are named. This isn't really a political representation. This is a naming practice, but one of the things I want to suggest is when we think about the past, it's important to think about the accidents of history rather than to imagine intention behind history. Vespucci then became the allegorical representation of European conquest. So this is, in fact, a Dutch engraving from about 1600, known as Vespucci Awakens a Sleeping America. And if you look at this image, what you want to really do is divide it along a diagonal from the upper left to the bottom right. And everything on the left of that diagonal, that is Amerigo Vespucci himself, is a representation of Europe, and everything on the right-hand part of that diagonal is a representation of the Americas. This is, in fact, a deeply political portrait. It communicates the idea of conquest in a number of ways. Vespucci is depicted clothed, standing. He's cloaked in the garments of civility, civilization. His staff has a cross on it. He represents Christianity. In the background are the technologies of European seafaring. He wields a sextant in his hand, the technology of navigation that made possible his voyage. And so everything on that one half of this engraving is depicting the arts and sciences and religion of Europe. And everything on the other side is depicting the absence of all these things in the Americas. The Americas are represented here essentially as a kind of Garden of Eden. There's something lush and sensual and beautiful and fertile about America here in what would become a convention represented as a naked indigenous woman. But it's important to note that this is, in fact, a depiction of rape. Vespucci is about to rape this woman. This is about the European rape of the Americas, the European conquest as a rape of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, as a theft, also as a planting of the seed of Europe on American soil. And this engraving actually also makes a powerful argument about the European justification for the seizure of those lands. If you look at the woman's hand, and follow it to what is actually the focal point of the engraving, there's a bonfire, there's a fire in the back. And that's a representation of indigenous people who it's actually a human leg that they're roasting over a spit. And the reason that that's an essential, in fact, the central and essential element of this engraving is that Europeans had no justification for taking these lands. Marco Polo didn't seize China when he traveled to China. The idea that you go to a place and you take those lands doesn't actually make sense, except for the argument that became necessary, which was to insist that the indigenous peoples had violated natural law, that they were cannibals, that there were other forms of ways in which they'd violated natural law, and people who violated natural law weren't allowed to own land. So this is a very deep political argument about the nature of conquest. This is Queen Elizabeth of England. This is one of my favorite representations of the idea of America. This is Elizabeth I in 1588. So when England had defeated the Spanish Armada, which that defeat is being celebrated in the scene in the background out her window. You can see the English defeat of the Spanish Armada, the great English triumph of against the Spanish invasion. But this is at a moment when England does not have any colonies in the New World. Unlike much of the rest of Europe, England is far behind in this work of founding colonies. But it's a representation of England's ambition in the New World. So the globe that the Queen is kind of daintily resting her royal hand upon, if you notice, she has her hand entirely over North America. It's this incredibly greedy, grasping ambition of the crowned heads of England for colonial acquisition in the Americas. This is an image that's very familiar probably to those of you in the room who might be American. This is one of the first representations of the idea of Britain's mainland colonies having a political affiliation other than that they were the colonies of England. So this is a woodcut engraving made for Benjamin Franklin's newspaper in Philadelphia at a time when Franklin was arguing that England's colonies should join together to wage a common defense against the French and against indigenous peoples who were fighting wars of defense against the English. So it's a really interesting political cartoon representing the English colonies. So from NE for New England to New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania is the P, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. So it's a political cartoon, but it's also a map, which is lost on people when you first look at it. It's just north is over here. This is the Atlantic coast. And Franklin was making this political cartoon at a time when map makers had invented a new children's toy, which is the jigsaw puzzle. This is a map that is also a jigsaw puzzle. So the first jigsaw puzzles were made by map makers who took maps and pasted them onto wood and then jigsawed them out so the children could learn national boundaries. This is one of the very first jigsaw puzzles Europe divided into its kingdoms. And the reason that jigsaw puzzles are interesting as a representation of place is that these borders were just being worked out. Nation states had fairly recently been formed. And the idea that, these lines exist as if they exist seen from the sky, as if they are written onto the territory itself, when in fact, of course, national boundaries, other than those that are natural boundaries, are legal fictions, became kind of realized through the physical process of cutting up maps into pieces and making them into puzzles. That picture that I showed you earlier of America, of Vespucci and a sleeping America, the idea of America as represented by a naked indigenous woman was commonplace throughout the 18th and the 19th century. This is a political cartoon from the age of the American Revolution depicting America as a naked woman, here prone, again being raped. But in this case, being raped by British tax collectors. So there's all kinds of iconography in this image but the men who are surrounding and leering and attacking America are British agents of the crown. So this is an argument for the American Revolution as the emancipation of America, the woman America. After the Revolution, America generally is changed into a different allegorical figure, the figure of liberty. So here, the woman in the white flowing gown is that older America become Europeanized with a white dress, and she always has a staff with the liberty cap on the top. It's an invocation of really of the French Revolution as much as anything else. But this image is a really important celebration both of liberty and of the American Revolution and the founding of America as a land of liberty, as much as it is also an indictment of the United States as the land of slavery. So this is another image that actually divides along the diagonal, where you can see, I think, quite clearly, again, from the upper left down to the lower right, that everything to the left represents liberty and the blessings of liberty, the arts and sciences, the knowledge. This is the painter's palette, the knowledge of the whole world, the the temple from antiquity, the knowledge of republicanism, the knowledge of antiquity, classical knowledge. And everything on the right represents the misery of human chattel, the misery of human bondage. And everything on the right is to do with suffering. And there is a paired figure. So there's Liberty sitting with her Liberty cap, but on the lower right, the woman, the African-American woman with the white kerchief, she is also an allegorical figure. She is the allegorical representation of slavery. And I just want to point her out because we'll see her again and again and again. She's often overlooked as an allegorical figure. She's not. We don't have a statue of slavery the way we have a Statue of Liberty. And this image has kind of been erased from Americans' own public knowledge. But you see her, for instance, here. Here's that allegorical representation of slavery. This is a political cartoon about Thomas Jefferson. That's Jefferson, the rooster, the cock. It's the philosophic cock is the caption. And the hen is Sally Hemings, who is his wife's half-sister and was his mistress and also his property and the father of 6 of his children. It's a political cartoon indicting Jefferson for his betrayal of liberty and his embrace of slavery. This really interesting painting from 1848 is, again, a representation politically of the idea of the United States as a self-governing place. Thank you. So it's called the American Hotel, and it's an allegorical representation of the country itself. And it's fascinating to look at. If you look at all the guys who are on the porch, they're reading the news from Mexico, which is the news about the war with Mexico, so it's really important political news for American citizens. And all the guys on the porch are people who can vote. Everybody on the porch is someone who can vote. The United States, by 1848, had granted the right to vote to all white men, rich or poor, immigrant or native-born, tax-paying or not tax-paying, educated or uneducated, and that's the range of people that are on the porch. If you were to look at this in 1848, these guys would look like a really motley crew to you. Like, it'd be obvious to you, oh, that guy's from the country, and this guy's an Irishman. Like, they look really, this is diversity. It's a celebration of the diversity of the American electorate in 1848. This is diversity 1848 style. So it's a real celebration of democracy. But at the same time, 1848 is the first year that women in the United States demanded the right to vote. So it's a little bit hard to see, but if you look to the right of the porch, can you see leaning out of the window? So there's a woman, she's not allowed on the porch, she can't vote, she's not a citizen in that way, but she's desperate to be there. She's listening to the political news being read from the newspaper. And then, even more interestingly, on the steps of the porch, not on the porch, they're not allowed on the porch, is a black man and a child, who, the way the child is dressed in rags, we're to understand these are enslaved human beings. And they, too, are listening avidly to the news, which is going to affect them more than anyone else. But the fascinating thing about this painting, it's the black man and his child who are in red, white, and blue. So it's actually a really kind of sneaky indictment of democracy and its limits in 1848. So here's Sojourner Truth. This is a photograph. It's the first photograph I've shown you. She was a fugitive slave, became a powerful abolitionist, one of the most important speakers of the abolitionist cause. And she's playing with here that allegorical representation of slavery, the kerchiefed black woman. But she's also, this is a little bit hard for you to see, but if you look in her lap, it seems to be she's just like in a grandmotherly way knitting. But if you follow the yarn in her lap, if you can picture the Atlantic coast of the United States, we're looking at Maine, and then we go down to the peninsula of Florida, over to the Gulf of Mexico to Texas. This is incredible claim. She's making America. You know, this is a claim for citizenship that has an audacity and a playfulness and a beauty to it that I'm just staggered by every time I see it. But this is at a time, you know, a year after the Emancipation Proclamation that ended slavery. American history in our political iconography has long toyed with the idea of a wall. This is the first time I've seen it in a cartoon. This is from 1882, in which a line of immigrants to the United States are taking stones from the Great Wall of China that have been carried across the Pacific and building a wall along the Pacific to keep out the Chinese. This cartoon is actually an indictment of building a wall, of the idea that the last immigrant in will build a wall. But that is at the very moment that Americans, of course, are celebrating immigration with the erection of the Statue of Liberty in the harbor of New York, which itself, though, is greeted with skepticism in California. Here is this is a political satire, but a proposed statue for the harbor of San Francisco, not welcoming Chinese immigrants, but asking them to stay away. The 1880s are the era of restriction of Chinese immigration in the United States, the very first time that the United States imposed restrictions on immigrants of any kind. That image of America as the Statue of Liberty, as the Lady of Liberty, is used by American women fighting for the right to vote in the 1920s here, trying to break free of the bonds of tyranny. The anti-immigration schemes in the United States in the 1920s didn't use the iconography of a wall, but often used this, which is a filter, that the peoples of Europe should not all be allowed to come, but that there should be essentially a racial filter, a eugenicist filter used on the nation's borders. If you follow the representation of America through to the Second World War, you come upon the popular culture representation of superheroes, of America itself as a superhero. Captain America is founded, was launched in 1940. Wonder Woman, who's the female version of Captain America, in 1941. And now the United States represents itself as, on the eve of entering the Second World War, as itself a superhero. America then claims its place on the larger world stage under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I just love this photograph of Roosevelt with this globe in the White House because it's a lot like that picture of Queen Elizabeth with her hand resting on the globe. It's a deeply ambitious representation of the United States' relationship to the rest of the world, and it carries a lot of force, I think, representationally. But what makes that possible, of course, are the arms and the manufacturers, the tremendous economic might that the United States brings to the Allies during the Second World War, not just its engagement in the war itself, but the provisioning of the troops, which the United States did long before it entered the war. So the sense of America's economic might married to the Allied forces becomes a big part of how Americans understand themselves in the era of the Second World War and immediately afterward. Americans also, though, understand themselves increasingly after the war as bits of data, as the general-purpose computers that were built for the Allies during the Second World War come into commercial use and are used by the U.S. Census Bureau to count the population, which is essential to our representational democracy. So you increasingly see images like this. This is from the age of Sputnik, of course, where we have engineers struggling with the representation of data before them on these printouts, but they are bearing the weight of the world. That American science in the arms race during the Cold War will bear that weight in a kind of atlas-like way. By the 1960s, the United States is beginning to kind of fall apart in terms of its political consensus, some of which is represented here in this beautiful Jasper Johns painting of the United States as in some sense melting, but in another sense kind of bleeding into itself. By the 1970s, after the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War leads to increased political polarization in the United States, there's a kind of sloganeering where even the flag itself becomes a symbol for political dispute. That's challenged by the modern environmental movement, which asks people, not just Americans, but people all over the world, to forget national boundaries, those jigsaw puzzle lines that are drawn by map makers, and imagine not nations, but the globe. A lot of that fantasy of globalism is part of the fantasy that if the internet hooks up the world, all political division will come to an end, which is in fact the fantasy of wiring the entire world and the nation. There's a lot of criticism of that early on that I think we now forget. This is a beautiful interactive piece at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art by the Korean-American artist Nam June Paik. It's an indictment of the internet where every state is broadcasting information about itself, and no matter how close you come to the sculpture or how far away you get, you can't actually understand anything anyone is saying. Everyone is broadcasting and no one is listening, which was the critique of the very early internet. And I think down to our moment politically in the United States, a moment of tremendous political division where it's almost impossible for people who belong to different political parties to agree on basic tenets. It's artists who have expressed these divisions best. This is one of my favorite pieces of public art by the African-American artist Glenn Ligon called Double America. Ligon was inspired in part by Charles Dickens's Tale of Two Cities, the sense that we can live in a place that can look one way to one person and look completely differently to another, that we could live in a time that could be both the best of times and the worst of times.